Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for what we expect will be another extremely interesting conversation hosted by the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress on National Security Space. Joshua Huminski, our program director here, has assembled a great crew of participants and will moderate a conversation for us and our participants, and we'll also try to save some time for audience Q&A. So as the questions come to you, please do feel free to submit them using the Q&A function or the chat function, and we'll try to weave those questions in. We're excited to host this conversation today. As many of our participants know, we have been studying national security space for several years now through various developments in the arena, a number of iterations. We've used a lot of methodologies to try to unpack some of the key factors in preserving and projecting America's national security position in space. And we have clearly picked an issue area where there is tremendous innovations. Most of them coming out of the commercial sector. Some of them make headline news and are seen on TV across the country. Others don't, but are all equally important in terms of technological developments that are driving this space, whether we're looking at launch or satellite technology, or data or imagery or any of the other multiple facets of national security space. It's an area that is vital for US interest, but also one where there is a rapidly developing set of capabilities that we want to continue to fold into our conversation. We are always proud to convene leading members of the commercial community as well as people serving in government, and believe very strongly that interactions there help us reach our mission and our end goal. We're pleased today. We've got some longtime friends with us, General Bucky Butow from DIU. Good to have you back. From the commercial side, our good friend Jeff Manber from Nanoracks. And we're proud also to have Payam Banazadeh from Capella Space in on this conversation, where we can look ahead a little bit. Every once in a while, it is useful to take a little bit of a step back from the day-to-day and really do try to peer over the horizon and look at where things are headed and see how we might be able to bend the arc of that trajectory to help us meet our mission goals. So with that said, welcome. Glad to have everyone. Let me turn over the conversation to our moderator today and our very capable manager of the National Space Program at CSPC, Joshua Huminski. Joshua?
Thanks so much, Glenn. I'm very excited to have this conversation today because I think we unintentionally landed at a very good time just within the last sort of 48 hours. For those of us who are on the call, if you haven't seen, there was a fascinating piece of Defense One that came out yesterday about how a US war game was conducted. And for lack of a better phrase, we lost quite badly. There's been a lot of debate about that, whether it's a good thing, whether it's a bad thing. And so putting that to the side, I think it's important to start thinking about the strategic competition with Russia and China at a bigger and much more significant level. At the same time, I think it was yesterday as well, another article came out about how commercial imagery was used to unpack the development of China's new missile fields, with the wonderfully named bouncy castles of death shrouding the construction there. And so I think in the two of those conversations and two of those articles, we see exactly what we're trying to talk about. Looking over the horizon to strategic competition with Russia and China and the integration of commercial technologies into the national security space architecture. We have three leading individuals on the very much the forefront of this in terms of General Butow, Payam from Capella, and Jeff from Nanoracks. And what we want to talk about today is how do we start looking at that over the horizon aspect? So not just necessarily what's in the next 3 to 6 months, but what are those next generation technologies and how are we going to pull them into the architecture faster? And so that's really what the core thrust of this conversation is, and what a core thrust of the project has been since the outset, is how do we build that national security future that we want, integrate commercial capabilities fast and effectively, but also create a structure that can respond to rapidly changing developments. Capella was founded 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, and is producing these unreal images of what's out there. Nanoracks is doing stuff with the International Space Station, looking forward to Outpost, which is a truly revolutionary capability. And then we have General Butow, who's working with both, but also looking at the bigger picture of how do we create a process that gets over the acquisitions valley of death and integrates those technologies and creating structures to do so. What I really want to start out with is I want to go straight with the meat of the bones here and ask the question to all three of you. Do we have a tech acquisition system that we need for strategic competition? Are we even prepared for it, or are we just so far behind the power curve right now that we're going to constantly be playing catch up? So controversial straight from the outset. General, I'll go straight to you first, and then Payam and Jeff, please feel free to jump in on that one. I think you might be muted.
Yeah, the interesting paradox is that we have a commercial industrial base that's quite capable of producing the technology we need. We have the budget authority, and we have the will of Congress that tells us that go buy commercial. So we have some internal challenges and cultural and otherwise that we need to overcome, because right now the nation, the government is oriented towards the 20th century, and the private sector is really oriented towards the 21st century. So the Defense Innovation Unit where I work, we were created to work exclusively with the commercial sector and accelerate the adoption of that technology. And both Jeff and Payam will tell you great stories of what they've done from nothing. I mean, they created companies, they created technologies that are low cost, scalable, and provide great great hope for the future. Our job on the government side is to be a good customer, not just an early adopter, but as capabilities mature, we need to buy these capabilities. It's amazing that you cited the discovery of not just one, but now two nuclear ICBM sites in China. That's leveraging commercial information in what we call peacetime indications and warning. And the earlier we discover things, the more apt we are to be able to share it with our friends and allies. We can lower the temperature of conflict and help shape and preserve, the United States and the world, and with a value system that we all aspire to retain. So I'll stop there.
Fine, if you want to jump in.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Excited to have the conversation with Bucky and Jeff. I think from my point of view as a commercial provider looking into government, there's still a significant gap. And I think the biggest gap is, even though we have found the product market fit, as we would call it on the commercial side, which is you've got users who really want this product badly, we still have a hard time getting those program of records type contracts to be able to get the products to the hand of the users as quickly as possible. And I think one of the main problem is we move much faster on the commercial side to go from just a concept all the way to real operational product. We go much faster through that cycle than government can even digest what just happened in the last few years. I mean, just to give an example specifically on Capella, I started Capella in late 2016, and we iterated our design twice, and now we're operating a constellation of 5 satellites, soon to be 7, and in just the short amount of time that we've been able to go from the concept to product, it took half of that time to just get the regulatory bodies to get comfortable with the idea of commercial SAR in the US. And so now that we've gotten that behind, we're starting to work on how do we get the product to the end users within US through different contracts. And those are not, the commercial side, once you get the product market fit, then it's just a matter of going through the contracting and getting on a contract. And it might take, a few months, maybe do a small pilot to get it to operational. But what I'm finding on the government is this is not a month, this is not a few month process. This is a few years of a process. And what's interesting is, the time it takes for us to get under those contracts, we're going to probably evolve our satellite and have another generation before the contract comes in for the previous generation. So the timeline for product development on the commercial side and getting under contract is just not lining up and aligning as well as I think it should, for us to be able to move fast and actually take advantage of the speed on the commercial side.
Jeff, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure, thanks. And let me thank everyone at CSPC for inviting all of us today. And let me say, on a more personal note, Joshua, my goal when I grow up is to talk as quickly as you do. That's going to be what I set out to do. So it's always great to be on a panel with you. You did get right to one of the major issues right from the beginning. It takes too long. It just takes too long. Now, how do you get around that? You have taxpayers' money, and you have to be careful. I think today we're going to talk about some of the ways you get around it. I know it is the system because, you look at two great companies, Boeing and Airbus. Each has a commercial division for aviation, streamlined, efficient, meeting customer demands, capital at risk. And then they each have a space division. And they're known for moving slower, having problems working with the government. Same company, same shareholders. Okay, there's no perfect example that it is the system and not the, let's say, the company or the shareholders. And so we do have a problem because, to put it in the most inelegant way, we've learned, especially with the pandemic, that democracies move slower. Democracies are less efficient than some of the other nations of the world. At Nanoracks, we're kind of also split in two, but not the way I just described with Airbus and Boeing. We're the largest commercial user of the International Space Station. And we've developed We've developed a very mature public-private partnership with NASA, with all sorts of government agencies, and that's very good. But on the other hand, and the reason for the discussion today is we're attempting to do something new from the government's perspective. We want to talk about reuse of in-space hardware for commercial platforms. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? Not only, we have to convince the government that they want to be a customer. And first off, government as customer is still fairly new. And yet here we are, a small company in Nanoracks, saying, not only do we want you as a customer, but by the way, it's something you didn't even know you wanted. Okay, and so that's the dilemma we are in, and we can get into how that is so difficult to in this unproven market of commercial destinations and commercial platforms with the current acquisition that exists in the government. So that's our challenge.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. So I want to pick up on something Payam had said, and also you had said, Jeff, was the speed of acquisition and the speed of innovation. There being a delta between the two. The commercial, particularly you had mentioned to Payam that you're going to be 2-3 generations ahead before that commercial contract comes through. And it reminds me of a conversation that I had in the Pentagon probably about 2 years ago, which seems like a lifetime ago thanks to COVID, where I was speaking with an individual who's tasked with acquisitions. And he said effectively, look, we don't want to touch commercial. We want to buy it. We don't want to step on their toes. We don't want to do anything to potentially affect the way that they're doing the development timeline. So, how does the government engage most effectively with the new space actors, such as Capella, such as Nanoracks? There's so much talk even then, even today, where it's, if you build it, we'll buy it, almost like the Field of Dreams model. Once your technology matures, is that the right way to go about speeding up that procurement process? Or is there some other medium between completely hands-off and very fully engaged, almost like one of the big defense contractors model?
Well,
okay, go
ahead. If I can chime in, it shouldn't be hands-off. Here's the thing: this is not a governmental problem. This is a United States problem. China has no problem working with this commercial sector. Now, it does it differently, but they have civil military fusion. There's not a thing that's developed in the commercial sector that the People's Liberation Army doesn't have immediate access to. That is a consequential threat to the way we operate. Robert McNamara is gone. He's no longer the SecDef for more than 50 years, but we still buy things as though he were the SecDef today. This is a fundamental problem with the way that we operate in the government. The PBBE, the way that we do budget cycles and forecast over 5 years time, it's based on a condition that no longer exists. The bulk of research and development occurs in the private sector, not the government sector. The bulk of the investment is in the private sector, not the government sector. The bulk of the demand, the market, is global. It's not the United States. And yet we go through the same cycle year after year after year, as though nothing has changed since 1962. So what helps, the reason why we're effective at being able to foster early relationships with companies like Capella, like Nanoracks and others, is because we're in DIU, we're not constrained by requirements. What we do is we take a problem and we go to industry and say, tell us how your commercial solution can solve this problem, either as a product or as a service, or even as a license. And so we want to prototype both the technology, but also the business model. The wonderful thing, what Payam was telling you earlier, is he's an agile company. Nanoracks is very much the same way. They're going to rapidly evolve. So why give them this specification for an iPhone 4 when you can have an iPhone 12, right? and then have the iPhone whatever comes out next year. 60% of the force, the military force, is below the age of 24 in the United States military. And we are crippling this generation by forcing them to use the tools of a different era. And so we're quite passionate about getting this solved and making sure that we can bring products and services in at much reduced rate than the things that are bespoke with high price tags, driving both sustainment and cost overruns because they're outside of the commercial marketplace.
May I say something, Joshua?
Of course, please.
So push back a little bit there. And seeing the other side, every administration takes some risks with companies, and the other political party of every administration delights in showing the failures. You've wasted our taxpayer dollars. This was a disaster. And so how do you get around, Bucky, how do you get around the problem that if you do something and there's a failure, then there's a political risk associated with that? Is that a fair statement by me, or am I missing the point?
Actually, the interesting thing is, I just used DIU as an example. We were born under the Obama administration. Right. We grew significantly under the Trump administration. And we're just at the beginning of the Biden administration with having really good, commercial transcends politics. I really do believe that. What doesn't transcend politics is politics, right? So if people are working outside of the trying to insert technologies that are not commercially viable into a commercial market, that can have a problem, right? So but we haven't really seen that. I mean, the interesting thing is our problems are on the Hill. They're institutional, and it's not DoD is not the unique in this, but I have to say I have to really applaud NASA, because all the greatest things that they've accomplished through public-private partnerships and working with the commercial sector, they do the same thing we do. They build menus. They don't try to pick winners, and then they fly things out and then they press with it. But DoD and other agencies should be following that example and getting more services that provide us with real value, so the government can focus on the government things that commercial sector cannot do.
Payam, if I can pivot to you on that same question of looking at what does that relationship look like for you and what you'd like to see going forward? Because you mentioned, I think it was a great point that the technology you're innovating on and being very agile and flexible on is going to be 2-3 generations ahead by the time that second or third generation contract comes through. And that's just one entity. If you magnify that across the DoD, especially as we're looking to China, to Russia, to future acquisitions and even technologies that are potentially on your drawing boards, how would you want to see that change? What would you like to see in terms of concrete changes to be made within the institution?
Yeah, so I actually think one of the best things that government can do is to pick winners, and to pick winners quickly and early, but then also be able to iterate and change their decision if there's a new winner. And I think one of the challenges that I see is, we've done SBIRs, they're fantastic, but they're actually not really producing that many big winners for the government. And so, I think the strategy of peanut buttering a massive budget in small, tiny contracts to as many as companies as possible in the 50K, 100K, 200K, just doesn't really produce the asymmetric outcome that it's going to significantly benefit the government. And so, as opposed to those much smaller contracts, if there's a product that's needed, for the government to come in and just declare that this is the winner for 6 months or for 12 months or for whatever the short duration, and then just always be open to pick new winners as it comes. I think that would be a great change, because what we're finding right now is the procurement process is going to be 3 years, and it's going to be a process. Even though you've got product that can save lives and immediately add benefits today, you got to go back in the line and you got to go through the process and be competed with folks that don't even have products yet. And the promise of some future timeline that they might have some products be literally launching in space sometime in the next 6 months. And so those are the challenges that I think it just prevents the commercial to move really fast when it comes to government. What we have also found as sort of a solution to some of these problems is to make sure that we are fully vertically integrated. And so we're constantly learning the new requirements that are coming in, because one thing that's for sure on the commercial side is you never have a perfect product, and in fact you intentionally go out to market with some sort of a minimum viable product that meets some of the requirements, and then you learn from the customer, you iterate, you change based on the new requirements that you're finding out, based on a new business model, based on your new understanding of the customers and where their pain points are. And so the product that we wanted to offer at Capella 5 years ago, compared to what we're offering today, and quite frankly, compared to what we're going to be offering 12 months from now, vastly different. And so the ability for us to be able to iterate quickly, even though the government procurement is not moving as fast, allows us to align those requirement adjustments over time and have sort of a spiral up improvements to our system to be even more aligned with the customer whenever they're ready, so we can meet them on their timeline. And so those are some of the things that we've done, and to essentially try to fit our products with the timeline for the government.
I want to pick up on something that you had just mentioned, which is a great lead into sort of the next question. You're talking very much about requirements. The government generates the requirements, puts the contract out there, and then you work to those requirements, which may change and might be superseded by successive technology generations. One of the conversations that we've had pretty regularly within the National Security Space Program at CSPC has been, is that requirements-based acquisition model appropriate, or do we need to shift to a capabilities-based requirement? Because if we look at it, the SAR technology has been out there, but what you produced may not have necessarily been on the government's radar at the time. And certainly for Jeff, for what Nanoracks is looking at in terms of repurposing second stages, that I can't imagine right now there is a requirement that's on the book for that, but the potential implications of that technology are significant. So how do we, should we, and this is where I definitely want the General Butow to jump in, should we shift to a more mission-focused or capabilities-focused acquisition model? Would that be more agile? Is that the appropriate way of going about it? Or is the requirements-based model working now? So I don't know who wants to jump in at that one first. If you want to take the stab at it first, General.
Sure. I actually think that's a great way to start changing the way we approach acquisition. Payam may remember when I think our solicitation for the contract that he was awarded was about a paragraph, and it basically stated that we were looking for day-night all-weather imaging at the limited persistence So it could be one satellite, it could be 300 satellites, but and we leave ourselves room to say, well, there's a difference between invention and innovation. The invention part, what Capella created a low cost, very capable, satellite that they can scale and update. But maybe what we want to do is combine it with analytics from a different company or broadband communications in different ways than what are commercially offered. And so the flexibility, this is where the other transaction authority that we leverage at DIU should be the gold standard, not SBIR. SBIR is a 20th century program. It's a tax. We tax the money that we use to fund things like Capella and Nanoracks. And then we tell companies that they're not really commercial for 5 years if they follow that model. So it's really important that we get this right. And I think that migrating away from requirements to capabilities-based acquisition would be wonderful. By the way, we're not an acquisition entity. What we do is we award prototypes. So we take all the risk out of these technologies as they evolve. We can try things. We have a lot of flexibility. So if you're going to stick to a requirements-based acquisition, we say that we help inform requirements for those customers. But then as Payam highlighted, then you're trapped behind the power curve in terms of leveraging the newest, greatest capabilities as they emerge.
Just one data point. The number of times that I have talked to the end user and they were blown away by the capability that we have, and then going to the procurement agencies and them telling me there's no requirements for this stuff. If I could get a penny for every time, I would be a millionaire right now. And that's just insane, right? Because there are people who are using this, would love to just immediately get access to it, but then folks are saying there's actually no requirement for this. So that disconnect is problematic.
Well, Jeffrey can speak to this, by the way, because some of the most incredible transformational innovations that we have were not derived from requirements, to include GPS. So requirements-based acquisition is not all it's. If you're going to build, a couple hundred, weapon systems, and you know exactly what you need, use a requirements model. But the Congress has given us some flexibility to use other tools that are appropriate for the types of acquisitions that we need to do. We need to do that, and part of that is taking the risk away from the people who need to be executing these contracts. So we have accountability, but we can still get the mission accomplished.
Some of the more interesting conversations we've had in Nanoracks has been with folks doing a requirement base and us trying to convince them that a repurposed upper stage does meet their requirement. It may not have been what they wrote it for, but it does meet your requirement. And we've lost every time. I mean, just saying, I know you didn't write it for this purpose, but here's what a repurposed upper stage platform gives you, and it meets your requirements. And they can find a semicolon where it doesn't meet the requirement because they weren't thinking about it. And I think to go back a few questions, I think the OTA is a very significant development. It's very powerful. I know NASA folks who have walked out of meetings and said, "Gosh, we wish we had OTA in some way." And then another point just to make is. The dialogue that's evolved. We created Nanoracks 11 years ago, and the maturity of the dialogue that has evolved with the government, with the very existence of organizations like DIU. I mean, we're on the right path. I think we all agree it's too slow, but we are moving somehow in the right direction. I get government officials now who ask us, how's your cash flow? How are you doing? Are you going to be able to, produce a next generation this or that? We never asked those questions 6, 7, 8 years ago. They had no concept. To them, getting money was just a mysterious thing of how it happened. So we're making great advances in the dialogue of how we can continue to innovate.
That serves as a nice segue to the next question that I want to jump in on for Senator Payam and for Jeff. both of you have taken advantage of the OTAs of the DIU model and have in various scales been through the process, if you will, working with DIU, which I think we're very fortunate to have General Butow here as an example of things that are working. So much when we speak about government, we talk about things that aren't working. So bravo, something's working. But looking at it, going back now, so you've been through the process, what would you like to see change based on your experiences? What worked, what didn't work? And I know it's an evolution, an iterative process, to certainly Jeff's point of how the questions that are being asked today are not the questions that were being asked 6, 7 years ago. So reflecting on that process, having been through it, what changes would you recommend or would you like to see if you were put in charge of one of those ubiquitous commissions to make reform recommendations?
Can we take General? Can we take out legal? I mean, it can be so slow. I don't know what to suggest. And I must admit, I'm not the expert who's working it daily in the company, but I just don't know how you speed up taxpayer money. There are ways to do it, of course. And we saw that with Operation Warp Speed. I mean, suddenly the money flow, billions of dollars flowed very efficiently, but quickly. And we got products. So there is a way to do it, but when you're dealing at the level of Nanoracks and all the new generation, new space companies and that are innovating like us and Capella, I don't know the answer to wave the magic wand. Maybe you do. I don't.
We actually had stellar experience on the legal contracting and the flexibility doing the modification on contracts throughout the life of the contract. And that was honestly, that was fantastic because, as we were evolving our commercial business, going back to DIU and adjusting the contract based on some new milestones was super straightforward and easy. And they were very open to it. I think the two items that I would want to see that would have been beneficial if it was different. One was if we had closer relationship with the end customers that are driving the prototype from DIU. Early in the process, as well as throughout the process, to start understanding the problem and form that relationship. And that ties to the second maybe feedback, which is again, prototyping and getting exposure is great, but you gotta have a way to go from that prototype to the operational contract. And so it's challenging to do a prototype without something that's already waiting for you on the other end of it. And that could actually be counterproductive because you've done the prototype, then we're essentially getting stuck in the valley of death. And so to the extent that we could remove that risk from the get-go by having those customers define and sign up and say, this is so important to me that if you can actually prototype and get it to the final stage, I'm going to be an immediate buyer. I think that would solve a lot of the problems.
So I'll chime in since I live this every day. I think things that I think would help both companies. We actually only less than half of the contracting that we do at DIU is internal, and we farm out to other contracting shops, and there's always a risk with that because that's not our lawyers, they're lawyers, and Jeffrey's smirking because he's lived this, and so for us, I think what's really sad reflection, and check your numbers, but it's the amount of commercial procurement done by DoD, which is the largest part of the federal budget in terms of procurements, is in single digit percentages. It's not 10%, it's not 20%, it's like 1 or 2%, and which is really sad because this idea that we can't move quickly, we've convinced ourselves we can't do this. But look at half a century ago at Kelly Johnson, Von Braun, Schriever. All these are people who moved with purpose, and they achieved incredible things in 5 years time, and or less. And so this is really a more recent predicament. Now I'm going to say something that's going to make the congressional folks nervous, which is one way that you can solve this with appropriate oversight, but in the budget, we should have a couple $100 million of discretionary RDT&E dollars, so that what we can do is when we have a successful validated prototype, we already have the authority to go directly into a production or procurement contract without recompeting it under the OT model. What we don't have is we don't have the funding, and the funding is locked up in the FIDAP. So you have priorities for DoD partners and customers, but they won't have the funding for it till 2023, 2024, 2025. And the company may be completely dead or acquired by the Chinese by then. So what we need to do is we really need to pivot to the 21st century. And we don't have to be really bold. We can just really throttle back to the way we did some things prior to the 1960s, because we worked in the 1950s, we moved very quickly on weapon system development. President Eisenhower, I think, had the appropriate oversight over things. Christian Brose, in his book, I think you reviewed it, Joshua, The Kill Chain, talks about this as well. But I think there's an appropriate balance where we can have oversight. I would rather go to the Hill, see the appropriators at the end of the successful prototype and say, can we please have this much money? So what we can do is we can transition this capability into the hands of the warfighters, normally in the combatant commands, so they can start using it for the year, just as Payam suggests. And then and maybe it expires at the end of that year. And then we have a decision point to figure out what we do next. But in doing this, what we also do is we send a positive signal back to the investors who have in a private sector, who have much more money than the government does invested in these capabilities. And some of them have told us that if we just award a reasonable contract for services, we don't have to wine and dine them or have conferences. They'll respond positively by investing more in these companies, and that's the way that our economy works. So we should embrace that.
Can I throw something in there, since Bucky brought up the investors? The venture capital ecosystem works by completing, essentially a circle, right? Which is I put money in and I got to get some returns. I mean, that's just how it works. And so the other part of this, besides from fixing the procurement issues that we're talking about, is how do you create exits within, government tech and technologies that have either dual use to government and commercial, or just purely are used for government. And I think there's a play there with the primes, right? And if you think about the primes, I think they predominantly rather do things internally and spend their money on IRAD or buying buybacks of shares. And so if there was some sort of a mandate where every prime had to spend a portion of every big contract that they get from the government to spend on commercial, I think that would be that would create a very interesting ecosystem of just primes essentially being mandated to work with smaller companies that are coming out of Silicon Valley, and ultimately maybe even foster M&A, which then would take the venture community, essentially make some returns, and then that would foster even more investment coming back into the ecosystem. So I think that's another. It's different than the procurement, but it's also part of the problem that I'm seeing.
I mean, one of the changes that I've seen, it's been really impressive. I mean, Nanoracks is about 100 people now. And we had a Bishop airlock. It's an airlock. It's now permanently attached to the International Space Station, largest module attached, completely commercially funded internally by us. Our two partners were Boeing and Thales Alenia. Okay, and we work very well, and I've been very impressed with Lockheed's and the Boeing's with their desire to work with the innovative smaller companies. In fact, it sometimes reaches a point, no offense to my friends over there, that we don't want to work with them because they're, it has its own issues of bureaucracy and that's difficult for us to understand. But I think that's another positive change, is that you see them making investments. I forget right now the name of the Boeing investment arm, and Lockheed has an investment arm, and Airbus has an investment arm, and so for better or worse, you do see that cycle beginning where the legacy companies are looking to replenish themselves, the innovation and market new markets, and increase their margins by acquiring the smaller companies or taking shares in them.
I'm glad you brought up the primes. 10% of our projects at DIU involve primes. So they're innovative too. And always, when we go to industry conferences, I always tell the primes, hook us up with your Mavericks, and give them the ability to work with companies like Capella and Nanoracks. And that's how we solve problems, because there's some legal things that we'll never overcome. We can't privatize everything that we do in the department. So they're not the problem either. And just as you highlighted earlier, Jeffrey, they take firm fixed price contracts. They do great stuff, and they work with us in small teams, and we accomplish stuff. So you really have to go back and look at how we're doing these procurement programs, and how can we do it better.
I think if we just stay on this for a moment, I don't mind sharing that our Bishop airlock cost us about 21 million, and we got some government funded equipment, GFE, with that, but it came in about 21 million. And folks in the industry told us you cannot do this for under 45 million. And it was just fascinating to watch. And so far it's up there and it's functioning. And it's just fascinating to watch. And we've learned how they go about pricing, and how many people they assign to something. And it was just surprising to us to see how many people are involved in a given project. It's a whole new way of looking at life. So there's advantages to each side.
Well, there's 2 points that I want to pick up on, and we'll separate the two, because I'm very glad that the general brought up Congress and the Pentagon writ large, and then also on the financing and the China question. I'd be remiss if I didn't put a plug out for our latest report, which we pushed out on May the 4th, very aptly appropriate for Star Wars Day, which Dan's going to drop into the question and answer feature, so you can take a look at our report. Addressing the financing side first. How do you foresee the funding and environment for space investments evolving over the next several years? Because if we're talking about over the horizon technologies, companies that are innovating that I think it was Jeff, you had mentioned, that might not be there in 4 or 5 years time by the time the acquisition cycle works its way through. Is it resilient enough against economic shocks? I mean, we saw what happened with COVID and everything shut down. That's about as big of a vertical system shock as you can find right now. How do we mitigate those risks to provide the government a measure of comfort with that investment and acquisition cycle, but then also, to Payam's point, providing off-ramps for those who are funding and financing the systems and capabilities?
I'll start off by plugging. We just had our State of the Space Industrial Base workshop in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we hope to have the report out next month. And one of the observations, as you appropriately highlighted, is that we were really frightened a year ago to see how COVID was going to impact a very nascent part of the economy, the new space economy. And we took a lot of steps to help shore up, but the investors responded very well. They made capital eventually freed up. And it's amazing to see where we're at today, even with companies closing SPAC transactions and getting meaningful contracts. So I think that's good. However, I think, as Payam noted, we have to complete the circle. And if the investors don't see the government, putting as money where its mouth is, and actually investing, or not investing, but just procuring products and services from these companies, then I think we'll see some retraction in that investment. at a time when foreign investment is going through the roof. We are competing with China in almost every instrument of national power, and we're not fighting them kinetically, but we are fighting them economically today, and they have a love affair for our technology. And so every day that we go by where we don't advance the state of the art and maintain the technological edge in the United States is another day closer to the end of democracy as we know it. I really truly believe this, because it's an authoritarian regime with bold plans that we all know about. And so we should be, we need to just bring the pendulum off the wall. Imagine if 10% of DoD's procurements were commercial and not restricted to requirements come from very well-meaning people, but who have the people deriving these requirements are completely dissociated with the commercial sector. If we can get that kind of relief, even for a limited amount of time, I think we would see tremendous gains. And if nothing else, we're creating jobs and we're improving the economy while we're doing it.
If I may jump in there as well, I think the problem of procurement is a big problem, right? And we're not going to solve in this forum, but we can. There's even an easier way to get even more capital and more technology and more companies excited to develop things that are going to be critical for national security, and that's just simply signaling. Just simply talking about what's important. You'd be surprised how much capital that can be raised by just going to investors and saying, this is a problem that's been defined by the government. Here's the report. They want this. Here is a well-defined path to go get there. And government has said it publicly, this is important, and they're willing to spend money on it. And so we don't even do that really well, right? Imagine if we had come out and said, commercial SAR is critical, and we want to be able to acquire commercial SAR over the next 5 years, and we want these type of resolutions, these type of products. It could be as generic as possible. It would just amplify the amount of capital that's going into just that one specific domain from multiple investors, multiple companies, lots of competition, and then ultimately the government is going to get the best solution. And so not only we're not doing the procurements as fast, we're not even being upfront about what are the problems that we really want to solve to then be able to get investors excited and jump in and help us solve those problems. And I think that's another thing to think about.
If Joshua, if I could go back to what the general was talking about on capital. And, there are different types of capital, different types of money. They have different desires, different half-lives. And we've seen the maturing in the space community of the capital that's involved. First, when I got involved in the industry several decades ago, there was no capital. Okay, it was all government. And then we began to see the VCs coming in, really led by the Elon Musk and the changes in the way the government was becoming more of a customer, and yes, signaling that they wanted to get out of the satellite manufacture business and be a user of SATCOM. That was an exciting moment several decades ago. But we've seen the maturing lately. And Bucky, you mentioned SPACs, and they have correctly come under a lot of criticism lately for a number of reasons. But one of the trends we're seeing is that VCs no longer represent the bulk of private capital available, and that is exciting. At Nanoracks, we were recently acquired by Voyager Space Holdings. They own a majority of Nanoracks now. And I was able to choose. I could have done a series, or I could have done something else. And I chose Voyager because it is what we would call patient capital. And they are not a PE fund. They are not looking at a 5 or 6. They don't have to exit their own round. They're in 5, 6, 7 years. And so we're seeing more patient capital coming in, where they're saying, look, and by the way, Voyager plans to go public probably the beginning of next year if the capital markets allow, but it's through a traditional IPO, which is more rigorous. And it's killing me now, but it's, I'm told it's like, you know, it's good in the, oops, I'm sorry, guys. Excuse me. And so it's more rigorous, but it's good. It's good in the longer term. And so one of the more promising things happening is that you're seeing different levels of maturity of capital. And so, yes, you're correct that they want to see the signal. We need to show a signal from the government. This is what of interest, but you're also seeing capital willing to come in, hedge funds, private banks, others now coming in that are willing to wait 10, 15, 20 years. That's new. And I'm hopeful it's a trend that's going to have an even more mature public-private partnership. As we get to the Holy Land, when the Chinese say and others say 50 years from now, we can never match that between our congressional budgetary cycles and the VCs. Well, now maybe we'll have more patient capital that allows us to plan out at least a decade.
I should just add, you know, we have two different companies on here, right? So we have you know, Payam and Capella, which is really they have a market-ready capability that can scale rapidly. And so that's really exciting. And Jeffrey and the things we're working on with Nanoracks, I mean, they have products and services today too, but the most exciting thing is how we're going to redefine space operations for the future and really truly create space as an economic domain, just as the land, the sea, the air. There are economies that are built all around those, and we want to benefit from that as well. So it's my turn to have my phone go off.
I feel better.
Yeah. Well, we're running up against the 3 o'clock stop, and so I want to sort of ask one final question for each of you. So the same question before I turn it over to Glenn to close up the conversation is, we've all touched upon a lot of changes that are out there that are needed. And this is very much a conversation we at CSPC will be continuing throughout the fall and into next year, especially as we start looking at those next generation technologies, working with congressional reform, working on sort of the finance equation, and specifically, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the geotech project that we've been working on at CSPC, which is that whole of government competition with China's authoritarian capitalist model. But before we close out, if I could just sort of ask you, what would be the one single greatest change, if you could pick one, that you would want to see if you were in charge for that day? What would you have, you know, from General Butow's perspective, from Payam's perspective, and for Jeff, to fix the acquisition process? If you had that one change, what would that be to leave folks with?
I'll give it to you. So I would, and General Raymond has already beat us to the punch, and certainly, and his other generals, is enable the Commercial Satellite Communications Office, which buys or procures most of the commercial SATCOM services from the and provides it to the military. Enable them to procure satellite imagery and analytics services for the military services. We use 70% of the satellite communications I use in my military role, or it's commercial. Imagine if 70% of the imagery I used in my military role was commercial. And that CSCO under the US Space Force can enable that. And that doesn't take anything away from the intelligence agencies. They produce intelligence products, which is only a fraction of the use of satellite imagery. So that would be my wish list.
So, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, I'll go. I guess you touched on it, Joshua, with government as a whole. I thought that came up in the last administration. You know, we have discussions with NASA on what sort of commercial FreeFlyers platforms they would like to see. And then we have discussions with DIU and others on what sort of platforms they would like to see. And, you know, as a provider of these goods and services, to be able to work with the government as a whole, and come up with what the government would like to see in FreeFlyers would be cost efficient. It's an unproven market, and to have the government acting with more of a single voice would be extremely productive and helpful to all of us.
Yeah, I would agree with Bucky, and then I would also add it would be nice to have a dedicated substantial budget every year that's just for commercial and can be used throughout the year, discretionary at a significant way for the government to essentially procure products that are coming online, and it's going to be adding immediate value. It's a dream, but I'm a dreamer.
We need dreamers.
That's what we're here is to try to explore those ideas and come up with some recommendations and then take them up to Congress, depending on the various principles to try to affect some change. So I can't thank you three enough for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Glenn to close out the conversation.
Well, I just want to echo that thanks, and thanks to Joshua Huminski for moderating the conversation and helping us look over the horizon a little bit. We talk a lot about innovation and bureaucracy, and some people don't think those go together, but they have to come into the same conversation. And I mentioned at the outset the great advantage we have with all the innovation happening on the commercial side. It's really the good news side of the picture here, and something we seek to capitalize on. But we do sometimes have to focus on process because it matters to outcomes. And seeking innovation in bureaucratic process can seem like an uphill climb, but it's important. And I just want to thank, we've got some really amazing, smart, capable and experienced good faith actors in both the public and private sectors that are grappling with this problem. We're very pleased to play a role of bringing them together and hopefully surfacing some solutions that will work and move the ball forward on that big mission that we all care about in protecting this country of ours. Thank you to General Butow, Bucky, to Payam, and to Jeffrey for leading this conversation with us today. Thank you to our participants for being with us, and wishing you all a very safe summer, and look forward to seeing you for the next conversation. Thanks and take care.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.